We are live. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the October version of Mind the Products Berlin, continuing our bite-sized series. I'm Alana. I'm one of the organizers. Continuing our bite-sized series of lunchtime chats with product leaders to try and motivate you through. Sorry. I just had the YouTube thing open in another window. Continuing our series of sort of lunchtime inspiration and chats. This month, we're very pleased to welcome Benjamin Kaiser, VP of Products from Contentful, a very illustrious CV, ex-Zendesk, ex-Intercom, and he's here to talk about changing context, so something that I think all three of those companies have seen as they grow from startup to scale up. The company's different, the way you run is different, so he's here to share some hints and tips and a couple of lessons that he's learned the hard way so we don't have to. Cool, over to you, Benjamin.
Well, hello, and thanks, Alana, very much for inviting me today. I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen and we can jump right into it. Is everybody seeing Startup to Scale Up Part 1? Yep. Okay. I'm going to just talk today about some of the things that I've seen in the process of going from the startup stage to the scale-up stage. They're very different stages. And there are sort of cross-cutting habits and behaviors that emerge in a startup that some of them work great in scale-up phase and some of them don't. And what I wanted to focus on today was specifically decision-making and the practice of decision-making and what we see in startups. And then as you start to scale up, how you can think about decision-making in your sort of growing organization. I would also argue that decision-making, even for startups at a small scale, is a great habit to establish. And really it's about that habit and getting good at it. And yeah, let's just dive right in. So in 2019, there was a study on startup failures, and there were two basic buckets of how startups failed. On the left hand, we have execution, and you can see there's different percentages for legal operations, technology, finance, marketing. Those are all ways that startups weren't able to operationalize what they were trying to do as a business, and that contributed to failure. On the left hand, you can see, sorry, on the right hand, you can see process related issues. There's an issue around team problems emerging and causing the startup to fail, and also on product market fit. And you know what's interesting about that is that's 54%. If you add the percentages together, that's over half of why organizations fail, is really around how do we figure out what to do for product market fit, and how do the teams relate to each other and work together. And for the one kind of thing that runs true through both of those processes of figuring out product market fit and also how teams relate to each other is decision making. And so that's what I really want to start today. So what is the impact of poor decisions? I think we probably all have a different version of this, but roughly you make the wrong investments. When you're in startup phase or even in scale up phase, every investment that you make is a commitment of time and money. And that commitment of time and money is not infinite. You only have a certain amount of time to really land what you're doing. And so it's important to sort of burn rate that you need to maintain, or might have some more significant consequences down the line. So poor decisions. The next one is that, you know, decisions are kind of a mainstay of startup life, frankly, a product life. It's what we do every day, almost all day long, is make lots of little micro decisions and sometimes bigger ones. And if you're making those decisions in a way that doesn't work well for everybody and is sort of misunderstood in different parts of the team, that can erode teamwork, and that's damaging. And then the third way is that if you build a team and make decisions where there's no accountability to those decisions, over time there's some further stuff that creeps in. So let's dig a little bit more into that. When you're in startup mode for the very beginning, it's all about keeping your head above water. You might have a great product idea. You're trying to build it as fast as you can. You're getting customers. You're trying to keep them. You're trying to raise money. You're trying to hire. You're trying to make progress. Those are all super crucial things for startups to worry about. And you're doing something right because you've gotten investment, you may have gotten customers, and so there's all this sort of opportunity ahead of you, and it's extremely exciting. And because you're doing all of this work, sometimes the decision-making kind of just happens along the way. So, in the startup, teamwork is crucial. And so as you develop as a startup, you focus on each other and that teamwork, and that you kind of develop a sort of inward focus about how you work together. In that decision-making process about what to do, oftentimes the large customers that you're seeing as that lighthouse towards success can have a very outsized impact on what you do. And the recency of their request can have an even further outsized influence. So that's something else that happens within the startup decision-making environment. Oftentimes, because there's no data, or it's really hard to get data about some things, we cherry pick anecdotes and decide, okay, that anecdote is representative enough, we're just going to do that. We know that it's the tip of the iceberg, but that iceberg is really big. And so you make decisions that way. Sometimes decisions are made by the founders. So you have a founder making the final call, and the team has some discussion, and the founder makes the call. In cases where there isn't like clarity on that, sometimes the team will just toss a decision around and around, and discussion goes on. And in that moment, because every moment that ticks by adds more stress, eventually the team can kind of like put their hands up a little bit and say, okay, I'll just leave it to the leader to decide because I can't decide, so we'll just let them decide. And then in this kind of mix of things that I've been talking about, the decision-making style evolves from those group dynamics. And then over time, that becomes your model for how you make all of your decisions going forward. What does that mean? Decision styles can really lead to a rabbit hole. I don't know if you guys saw the animation, but I did a little animation down the side there. I'm not sure if it comes across in StreamYard, but it was supposed to be cute. I hope you enjoyed that. Let's talk about that first one I mentioned, leave it to the leader. So if you leave it to the leader, if you're always looking to the founder, or maybe it's a very strong product person in that small startup team who it feels that pressure to always be meeting the team's expectation as well of making that decision. Over time, as they are human beings and will make wrong decisions and will oftentimes feel stressed themselves and make decisions maybe in not the best of circumstances, that can over time create a perception of arbitrariness, unfairness, or ineffectiveness. Because what happens is that decision gets made, it doesn't work out for whatever reason, and then the team over time starts to think, well, maybe this isn't really the right way to do this. The other thing that happens, if there isn't like the clear leader who's going to make all the decisions framework in place, you end up with ego battles between personalities. You might have strong engineering lead and a strong product lead and a strong designer, all kind of like fighting a little bit. And maybe it's maybe you talk about it as being healthy conversation and healthy discussion, and it can be for sure. But there's a point at which the decision's not getting made and the egos continue to battle, and that's where it goes from positive to negative. This is the sort of tip of the iceberg situation where we think we know because we have some anecdotes and they sort of point in a direction, and it looks like the tip of the iceberg, and we don't have time or data to do anything else, so we're just going to go with that. In those situations, oftentimes the failure of those decisions, if they don't succeed, sometimes they do. Sometimes it's it's a great decision to make, happens to be good. Sometimes they fail. But what happens in that case is oftentimes the execution of the decision rather than the decision itself gets discussed. And so you're not actually getting back to the root of where the problem came from in many situations. And that can lead, in the worst case scenario, to blaming. And blaming is extremely bad for teams, as we know, and that contributes to that 54% of failures. There's another version of the ego battle, which is the agree to agree version. And really, this is just everybody being super polite, but they're sort of not wanting to concede or change their position for the good of the group or the good of the decision. They instead sort of like keep the conversation going and going and going. This kind of paralysis is terrible decision making, and it wastes your time. And wasting time is really wasting the opportunity that you have. And then the last one, which is, I think, often kind of brought out sometimes by product, sometimes by engineering as proponents, is that You say that, oh, well, agile is the way that we'll get to the right decisions. And so you look at the funnel of decisions and then outcome. And basically what we're saying is we're not going to really decide much at the top. We're just going to let it flow through the agile process. And then somehow through that process, we'll get to the right thing. You know, the problem with that, of course, is that if you don't make some key good decisions or base this on something at the top of the funnel, what you get out at the end of the funnel isn't really that much better. Once you start an agile process to sort of iterate on software, whether you sort of would like to believe it or not, there are boundaries then of what you really are focusing and narrowing down on. And that, in essence, just kicks the hard questions and hard decisions down the road. And you could end up scrapping what you've built and starting over. And again, that's a waste of time and momentum. And there's ways to avoid that. Okay, so I just wanted to tell you a small anecdote to sort of illustrate some of these concepts. I've worked with a lot of different startups as mentor. And there was one that I was working with. It was a B2B proposition that had a core part of their proposition was voice recognition. And it was really involved in their USP. And the leaders were really, really committed to this idea. They had a great VC pitch deck. They got money because of it and got their company started. And it turned out over time that, you know, the voice recognition part wasn't as simple as we thought it was going to be when we started. And the more that the evidence started to accumulate, the more afraid and off limits the topic of voice recognition being the USP became, because there was such an emotional investment. And this was a kind of a leave it to the leader sort of culture. And because it was leave it to the leader, it was off limits and they never really questioned it. And then, fortunately for this company, the founders were in a conversation with one of their customers and they were talking about usage of this product in the field. And the person who was using their product started to cry. And they were, you know, flabbergasted. Why are you crying? Why are you crying? And she said, well, I can't get the app to understand what I'm saying because of my accent and because how quietly I speak. And I'm afraid I'm going to get fired. And that was sort of the light bulb moment for this founder team that, hey, this is not, you know, we can't fix this. And this is probably something we should really consider. And so they at that moment, the sort of good news here is at that moment they pivoted what they were doing. They realized that voice was never going to be the universal tool that they thought it was going to be at this moment in time, at least. They pivoted and they're doing something else now that's more successful. So you're thinking to yourself, possibly, I recognize maybe some of those things going on in decision-making in my organization. What do I do? Like, you know, some things about decision-making that I could change. But before you change things, there's just a couple of things that I want to point out. First of all, you need to recognize first that decision-making is a practice. It's not something that should evolve naturally from a group of people. It's something that you should separate, make objective, and say, okay, we're going to get good at decision-making. And that means everything from which restaurant we pick for lunch all the way to what our next big investment will be. And the reason why you want to get good at it is because it's part of the meat and potatoes, the bread and butter of effective teams is to make decisions all day long. And if you don't clarify this aspect of team behavior, it's just going to keep in little ways coming back to you. So it's a really good habit to get into. The sort of place to start is write everything down. Because if you can't write it down, then you don't know what the decision is. So it's actually a good test of what is the decision. And if you can write it down and read it back to yourself and understand it, that is a great way to know, yep, we're actually doing a pretty good job here making a decision. And the other thing to recognize is that decision-making practice is a journey and not a quick fix. You can't just adopt a framework or change your pattern right away and expect it to work. So you have to have patience, and it's an evolution. So where do we go from here? How do we actually get on that journey? Oh, that was not supposed to happen. Behind this, this slide, which I think I'm just going to try to fix, if that's okay, because it's actually important. Yeah, that's better. So more effect and less affect. What I mean by this is really reduce down the amount of emotion involved in decision making. Part of making it become a discipline and a practice is to really limit the emotional aspects of the team interaction. That doesn't mean don't have passionate conversations, but what it does mean is that the passionate conversation isn't the goal, the decision is the goal. So what you're looking for is the result of that conversation, and not indulge in a lot of kind of over-poured emotion throughout the conversation. So ways to get there. Acknowledge what your current decision-making style is. The way you do that is by just sort of note how long it takes to make a decision. Note how much recycling of that decision takes place. There's one of the characteristics in poor decision cultures is that you constantly question the decision that was made without necessarily new evidence or new substantive sort of directional cues, but you keep questioning the decision and redoing it and changing it. And if you can note that and see how the decision has evolved and why, that can give you a really good idea about which decision-making style you have. And then note, of course, the effect of the decision and look at the results. And that is actually a much harder ask than it may seem on paper. It takes a long time to get good at that, to really be able to tie back, like, okay, we made this decision and that had this impact and then these results. And then once you've done those three things in number one for a while, then you can start a conversation with leaders, or if you are a leader, start it with your co-founder or with your team about the decision-making as a practice, and be able to point to your current style so that you can say, look, I think this is the style that we have. Let's get better at this. And you can explain how that style works if you do those three notations that I mentioned earlier. And avoid the third kind of like less affect thing is avoid discussions about individuals or their styles. So for example, that conversation would be, Frederick is really great and articulate, and he just convinces everybody. And I just love it when Frederick makes the decision because he's so articulate. Well, what you actually want to talk about instead is Frederick's role is product designer. As a product designer, he should own this part of the decision or be contributing on this part of the decision very significantly. So let's see what Frederick says about this decision piece. And so it's that shift from individuals and people into roles and what the role plays in the decision making, and that adds adds an objectivity to the practice that then reduces down the emotional aspects of it, the personal aspects of it, and can make it a more objective, easier conversation to have when you're focusing on efficiency and conclusiveness rather than on people. And so these are some mental knots. These are things that you just want to watch in yourself and in your team as you go along. So you want to optimize for metrics and not judgments. Like, it's not that Frederick made a bad judgment. It's that the metric is showing that this decision failed. So we should probably quickly, put a pin in it, come back and rediscuss with the new data and figure out what to do next. When people express what they believe, take all of those as hypotheses to test. So instead of saying like, well, Frederick's opinion was this, so it means this, this, this. Instead, it's like, Frederick had an opinion. He's hypothesizing that this is true. How do we test that? And that's the right way to sort of tackle opinions rather than connecting them to the person and the relationship. Instead, treat them as a hypothesis to be tested. Again, roles, not personalities, we talked about. Disagree and commit and not recycle. It's a super important one. You have a velocity of decisions that you need to tackle every day. It's not worth your time to work out the best answer for every single decision. Sometimes it's better to just say, okay, the overall value of this decision is less than some other decisions that are being discussed. I'm going to disagree and commit to whatever comes out of that discussion. And I'm going to focus my energy over here where I want to add more data to this conversation so that we end up with a better decision among the team. And the last kind of, I think, habit that helps you with decisions is that you think about, instead of thinking about features and what you're going to build next or customer delight or how customers are feeling, instead think about investments. Why do I say that? Well, it's always going to be true that we should build things that customers want and are delighted by. The thing is, if you have $10 to invest and there's two projects that are equally expensive to build, how are you going to know which one to do next? The one to do next is, it's not going to be on cost. It's going to be on what is the impact to the customer and what's the impact on your future as, you know, in terms of revenue, in terms of reducing your own cost, in terms of opening up opportunities for building a lot of new things that might lead to even more revenue. So when you think about features as investments instead, it kind of really opens up an objective discussion about what will the impact be on us as a business and on our customers, and not only what is this, how customers react, will they love it or not? That customers will love a lot of different things, and we have to be able to sort of put them in order, especially at the startup stage when you're trying to get into scale-up stage, because you only have a limited runway. At Contentful, we use the rapid framework for decision making. If you are having a difficult conversation around decision making, one sort of easy shortcut is to adopt a framework. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's a Bain & Company framework that was developed a while ago. Basically, RAPID is an acronym for all of the different roles you see here. You can easily Google this and read more about it. But the thing that's really great about it, the thing I wanted to bring forward and to really sort of emphasize here, is that you can write down what it is you're trying to decide, what the decision was, and who should be doing what. And it's the definition of the roles within that decision making that's so critical, because then it doesn't become an ego battle or we'll do what the leader says. It's really about, okay, your role was input here. We've taken your input. Thank you very much. And now we make the decision. Or actually, I'm the decider here, and so, you know, I'm going to go and get a recommendation from the person who is the named recommender here. So it really clarifies the roles, and those roles then clarify how the decision gets made. It can really speed things up, and then it allows you to sort of look back at it and see what happened if you need to get better at making decisions. So I have one more anecdote to share with you. I was working with a social media company in London when I lived in London, working for Canonical at the time. And they were building in a kind of a social media application, but it was kind of a niche application. And they were going through a sort of a rebranding, redesign effort, mostly for functionality and for performance, because their app was falling over and they needed to be able to sort of scale up a bit more. And they were struggling around with the design. And at some point, the color scheme came up as a thing to discuss. And so I suggested to the CEO, look, don't spend a lot of time on this. It's not worth it. In all the decisions that you need to make right now, this decision is number 5 or 6. It's not number 1 or 2. So just pick next year's recommended Pantone color, pick a shade of that, and use that until you know exactly what you want to do with your brand later on. The time to value here was the reason why that was important. And on this decision, I was a recommender. The CEO was the decider, and she was the one who ended up making that decision. And there was also a board member there who was the agreeer. The input was the marketing head. In this case, in that discussion, the marketing head strongly disagreed, because they thought that the rebranding and design was a moment to stop everything and really work that out so that they had a good basis for going forward. In my mind, the marketing head was wrong, because it was a time to value discussion, not about, yes, would it be better if we did it that way or not, but more just time to value. As it turned out, the CEO took the recommendation. They used the Pantone color. The board member agreed with that. The marketing head agreed to disagree. Within a year, that company had been invested in heavily, moved from London to the Bay Area, created a much larger market and got more funding there. And then within, I think, a year and a half or 2 years, did a major rebranding effort and has continued to grow and is now a very successful company. So I guess the lesson here is, like, not that the rebranding wasn't a good idea or important, but just that when you do it is just as important as what you do. And sometimes it's about timing and having the right people on the rapid, in this case, let them make the right decision around timing and sacrifice what might have been the perfect brand for the short term in order so that they could get more funding and get that opportunity later on. And that's all I wanted to say about decision making. Thank you very much. I don't know if the deck is available after the talk, but my contact information is here. Please take a screenshot. I'm happy to speak with any of you about this. And now I think it's Q&A time.
Cool, thank you. And yes, the talk and the slides and everything will remain up at this link on YouTube. And just a quick reminder, please post questions in the chat, and we'll start the Q&A, aiming to finish probably about 10 to 1. So let's grab, okay, first question from Gavin. When talking about investments versus features, how far should you quantify that investment? So man hours, dollar value, is that too much detail? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a really great question. So because we're kind of frameworky over at Contentful, we tend to use relative quantification methods that helps teams evaluate the difference between in things like effort. So we use RICE for that. RICE is just a framework that's like includes effort and the impact that we think will have and the customer reach. There's some factors there. You can look up the RICE framework for decision making. It came from Google. I worked with it at Intercom. It's just a way that teams can start to have the discussion and weigh things up. The key one there is the I, which is impact. What is that? And what you're really asking here is, do you have to know to the penny how much revenue you expect to get from this thing? And the answer here is it depends. And the reason why it depends is sometimes it's about cost savings. Sometimes it's about CSAT or NPS. Sometimes it's about direct revenue. Sometimes it's about indirect revenue. So it depends on what that impact is and then what kind of a credible business case can you build around it. And what I would say to a product manager is make it as credible as possible, because then it's a lot easier to argue for it. The less credible it is, the less detail you have, the less obvious it is to invest in it. And at Contentful, what we do is we have an evaluation step where we kind of look and say like, okay, here's what you are saying the business case is as product manager. That's great. Let's look at that and see what the investment would need to be in order to get there. And then depending on how much we believe that case, we sort of rank it as, okay, this feels about 90% right. So yeah, okay. Or is it like 50% right? And no, go back and do more quantification. So I would say, again, this is a process and there's no hard and fast rules. You only have the data that you have. You can't just make stuff up. So you have to be creative and think about how you can get more credibility and detail into that business case and do the best you can. It's best effort. It's not a science.
Good, thanks. I see a comment from Kim. Great session. No question, but super encouraging that we're on the right track. So that's some good news for Thursday. Okay, next question from Dimitri, one of our other organizers. Do you have any good books, blogs, other resources to help with decision making?
No, I don't. I mean, I think the decision making observations that I've made have come from like a lot of different kinds of product approaches, but not specifically about decision making. So what I'd like to do is think about that question some more and see if I can't pull something together. That, but I don't have anything off the top of my head like this. This is a great one about decision making, other than read up on Rapid, and you can start to see how they think about that framework. But is there a way that I can come back to Dimitri?
Yeah, sure. We can make sure we get that message out.
Okay, I'll look into that and try to come back to you with something. Okay, next question.
Cool. Next question. What are the first steps a company? Yes. What is the first steps a company should take if they realize that they're bad at decisions? What has the biggest impact quickly?
Start talking about decision making as a thing, rather than talking about people and how you're frustrated about this or that or the other. Start talking about it as like, you might talk about your diet or your yoga practice. Like, okay, from 11 to 12 every day, I'm gonna do my yoga and I'm only gonna eat avocados. It's very easy to talk about that as a separate thing. You should be able to start to have a conversation about decision making in that same light. So it's really like, I think we could get better at making decisions. Here are some things that I think we should consider. What if we tried assigning roles? Like in the decision making, what about this? And that's how I would go about it. So the most impact is to open that conversation and socialize the idea that they need to get sort of athletic about decisions. That makes sense.
It does. Thank you. I guess, okay. Thanks, Zaki, for clearing that up. Okay, so next question is, what's your thoughts on using predictive chart for the requirements for the next few quarters? How to make sure resources are well allocated between scaling up and between new features?
Yeah. So I guess the way I would reframe this question, because embedded in the question is the sort of the dialogue that I've been in many times of like tech roadmap versus features, right? And that is the typical discussion that you have. That is absolutely the wrong discussion. That is a useless discussion. The better discussion, in my opinion, this is my opinion, I'm just being opinionated, they're all features. If a platform doesn't perform, that is not delivering to the customer. That's a failure. So you have to think of all of the stuff that needs to be done as features. Performance is a feature, uptime is a feature, and start to roadmap it all in the universal, this is the roadmap. So, but what are the implications there? I mean, it's easy to say that, but what the implications are that then engineering has to have access to input on the roadmap. And what's your process for that? And what's your process for weighing up this feature versus some technical debt or something else that needs to happen for us to get scale? The way to do that, again, is you look at the impact and you build a business case. So if an engineering manager says, you know what, I need 6 months because I want to refactor the entire platform because it's not going to scale up and it's not going to perform, and in 3 months we're going to be dead in the water. Is that some? How can you quantify that? How can you find the steps along the way that will start to give you value, just the way you would with the feature? What is the first next step that we could do on refactoring that will give some customer value, let us be more performant, let us scale better? So it isn't like one or the other, and you have to treat technical roadmap items, so to speak, as features where you're looking for what's the MVP of that huge reformatting scale up thing, and choose that, and then the next one, and it doesn't have to be a straight line. And the confusion in those conversations are usually around engineers starting here and wanting to go here in a straight line. But really what you have to accept is, no, we're going to pick something that delivers a bit better, opens up some bottleneck, does something that adds value. And we kind of will zigzag and know that we're going to have to refactor some of those early decisions as we go. But that's a better decision to make than, okay, we'll stop everything and we'll just wait for 6 months until we get to this North Star nirvana that is going to solve all of our scaling problems. So treat them like regular features, bust them up into small units of value, just like you would bust up a normal feature, and roadmap them in the same process with the same arguments, the same business cases, et cetera.
Thanks. Yeah, I think probably all of us recognize that conversation from somewhere we've worked. Okay, next question from Ilya. What would be the bottom-up strategy to move from the CEO calling all the shots to giving more autonomy to the product teams?
So it's really a loaded question, right? So there's a couple of different things here. So what you have to sort of, I think, first establish is an understanding that autonomy is not actually a thing that you will ever have. So autonomy is not what you're aiming for. It's not either CEO or I'm autonomous. It's instead, what is our business strategy? What's our product strategy? What does our team strategy do within that product strategy and bigger business strategy? And who owns what? And then what's the decision-making style that we adopt so that the team strategy fits to the product strategy, fits to the business strategy? And when you have that alignment, you get out of this useless conversation of autonomy, no autonomy. That conversation is the one that you have when you're not actually addressing the underlying problem, usually, which is you might not have a clear product strategy that everyone understands. You might not have a clear business strategy that everyone understands. So in this case, I would start conversations on 3 fronts. I would ask the CEO for, what is our business strategy? How does our product strategy fit into that? How can the team, this particular team, move toward the product strategy that will then feed the business strategy? That's one part of the conversation. The other part, again, is, can we talk about decision-making styles and can we agree or wrap it? And the more you write down, for this decision, you know, the decider is the CEO, and the decider is the CEO, and the decider is the CEO. Over time, it will occur to everybody that doesn't seem quite right. And then you can start to have discussions about, like, do you really need to decide about the color of this app, or do you really need to decide about this? Because you have other things to do. You're raising money, you're building the business strategy, you're an important person. let us take some of the load off you and the parts that we can do. And once you have those that framework and you're able to sort of call out the number of decisions you're asking that CEO to make and discuss that objectively on the table and say, look, there's a pile of 50 decisions here. Are you sure you really want to make all of these? Over time, that CEO will learn and stop doing it. But if you get into the conversation, again, I just want to double down on this. If you talk about autonomy versus not autonomy, you're never going to get movement on this. Instead, talk about business strategy. My advice.
Okay, thanks. We just got a thumbs up from Ilya. Next question from the Mind the Product team as well. At what stage should companies and leaders start to think about this? Is it something from day one? Is it a VC round? Is it at a certain stage? What's your experience?
Yeah, so as I was trying to say early in the presentation, startups have a lot to do and they're busy, really busy. So oftentimes it doesn't seem like stopping to discuss process in a very objective way is the top priority right now, because instead we need to make all these decisions. And what I would argue is that you have to slow down there to speed up. If you can practice that decision-making style early and get good at it, it just makes everybody's life faster, easier, more efficient down the line. So I actually don't think there's any time that's too early to start. If you do end up starting later, I'm really sorry. If you do end up starting a bit later, you can still get there, but the earlier you start this, the better. And again, I really want to emphasize there is no right way to do this. There's probably a right state that you want to end up in, which is that it's not emotional, that it's more objective, that everybody feels like their role in the decision was correct and that they got the input that they wanted to have, or they understood it, or they understood the reasoning. Those things you can achieve as early as day one if you're clear and have that conversation. So I don't think it's too early. I also think you can start later if the dynamic seems to be pretty healthy.
Cool. Thank you for that. One other question from Young. Beyond getting better at decision making, what are some other key things to watch out for as you go from startup to scale up?
I guess what you're asking is sort of like what I'm hoping to do in the series here, because I'd like to have the next thing and the next thing about some things that I see changing from startup to scale up. Some of the stuff is really obvious and simple, like write down what's important to you as a product team. What are the principles that you function on? So for example, when I joined Contentful, I just wrote down the 4 principles that were really there in the product team, but nobody had written down, and we hadn't really pointed to them because as people joined up, they were kind of getting them from osmosis because we were a small team. There's a point in Scaleup though where that stops working because people end up only dealing with new people just by happenstance, or they don't actually get connected with some of the earlier conversations either on the wiki or people explaining things. So they lose touch with the context. So one of the practices is writing things down. So as you go from startup to scale up, getting into the habit of not relying on Slack, not relying on conversation, but instead, when we talk about a decision, we write it down in a durable place. Slack is not that place. You should not, by the way, I didn't mention this in the talk, but nobody should be making decisions in Slack. If you agree a decision, write it down in a document someplace that we can refer back to, because that's the only way that we're going to learn to grow and get better at decision making. And Slack is like a vast pool of lost things, and it's impossible to pull out when the decision was exactly made in a conversation that goes on and on and on and on. So no Slack. Anyway, if you're writing decisions down in a document, also write down the product principles. Also write down many of the process pieces that you've been naturally doing, but other people joining the organization won't necessarily get. So another habit to form is write stuff down, and write it down in a way that is shareable, it's easily findable, and that you understand what that corpus of knowledge is that you definitely want the new person to absorb and get. That's one example.
Cool. Okay, thank you. And yeah, it's a nice segue into saying we hope to have Benjamin back in future to present a few more startup to scale up topics. So if you have any suggestions, feel free to send them to us. There's a Mind the Product Slack with the Berlin channel that we're in. And yeah, feel free to send us feedback about today, about the format, about the time. This is all one big experiment to try and see how we can keep the community engaged and keep learning while we can't all meet in person. So I guess if there's no other questions, thank you very much, Benjamin. And a reminder that this YouTube link will stay up. The slides and the talk will always be available, so you can refer back if you find yourself in this situation. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a nice Thursday, and look forward to seeing you at a future ProductTank Berlin or otherwise.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.